March 9, 1945. High above the sleeping city of Tokyo, American B-29 Superfortress bombers began their approach at an altitude far lower than anyone expected. They came in darkness, stripped of their guns, loaded instead with something far more sinister: canisters of jellied gasoline, napalm, and magnesium incendiaries designed for a single, horrifying purpose. In his operations room on the Mariana Islands, a stocky man with a perpetual cigar clenched between his teeth watched the mission clock. Major General Curtis Emerson LeMay had gambled everything on this night. He had ordered his aircraft to fly at 5,000 feet instead of the usual 30,000. He had removed their defensive weapons to make room for more bombs. He had calculated the wind patterns, the density of wooden structures in Tokyo's neighborhoods, the precise temperature at which human flesh would ignite. By dawn, 16 square miles of Tokyo would be ash. More than 100,000 civilians would be dead, more than would die at Hiroshima or Nagasaki. The fires would burn so hot that the canals boiled. Mothers clutching their children would be found fused together by heat so intense it turned bone to dust. The attack would represent one of the single deadliest nights in human history, and Curtis LeMay would consider it a success. This is the story of how an American general became known as the man willing to burn the world to win a war, and why, decades later, historians still debate whether he was a brilliant strategist or something far darker, a war criminal who happened to be on the winning side. Curtis LeMay was born in Columbus, Ohio on November 15, 1906, into a world that would spend most of his lifetime at war. His father was an iron worker, drifting from job to job, moving the family constantly through the industrial Midwest. The instability bred in young Curtis a particular kind of hardness, not cruelty exactly, but a deep-seated pragmatism that would define everything he became. There was nothing in his childhood that predicted greatness or infamy. He was quiet, methodical, uninterested in the social graces that smoothed one's path through life. Where other boys were learning to charm and persuade, Curtis LeMay was learning to calculate, to solve problems through pure determination and the willingness to do what others would not. He found his calling in the sky. After a brief stint studying civil engineering at Ohio State University, where he joined the ROTC mostly because it paid, LeMay discovered military aviation. In 1928, he received his commission as a second lieutenant in the Army Air Corps Reserve. Flying was more than adventure for him. It was a realm of pure cause and effect, where skill and preparation determined outcomes, where sentiment meant nothing and results meant everything. The military gave structure to his natural inclinations. The Air Corps was looking for men who could think systematically about the emerging science of aerial warfare, and LeMay proved exceptional. He became expert in navigation, in bombing accuracy, in logistics. He approached flying the way an engineer approaches a bridge, as a problem to be solved through mathematics and discipline. But there was something else, too, something his fellow officers noticed and sometimes found unsettling. Curtis LeMay had the ability to divorce himself entirely from the human consequences of his decisions, not through callousness necessarily, but through a kind of radical compartmentalization. When he calculated bomb trajectories, he saw coordinates and blast radii, not homes and families. When he planned missions, he thought in terms of target destruction percentages, not human casualties. This would make him invaluable in the war to come. It would also make him terrifying. When World War II erupted in Europe in 1939, the American Air Forces faced a fundamental problem. They had developed an elaborate theory of strategic bombing, the idea that wars could be won by destroying an enemy's industrial capacity from the air, but they had no idea if it actually worked. The theory was beautiful in its logic. If you could destroy factories, rail yards, oil refineries, and power plants, you could cripple a nation's ability to make war without ever engaging its armies. Bombing could be surgical, precise, devastating to military capacity, while sparing civilian populations. It was warfare for the modern age, clean and efficient. And Curtis LeMay would be the one to prove how catastrophically wrong that theory was. By 1942, LeMay was a colonel commanding the 305th Bombardment Group, part of the 8th Air Force stationed in England. His mission? Daylight precision bombing of German industrial targets. The American strategy depended on the Norden bombsight, a technological marvel that theoretically allowed bombers flying at high altitude to drop their payloads within 100 feet of their target. The reality was carnage. German fighters tore through bomber formations. Flak turned the sky black with exploding steel. Men died in burning aircraft or froze to death in the thin air at 25,000 feet. Of the crews that flew with LeMay in those early missions, the mortality rate approached 90%. And despite the sophisticated bomb sights and careful planning, most bombs missed their targets entirely.
LeMay's response was not to question the doctrine, but to refine it through sheer force of will. He developed new formations, the combat box, that maximized defensive firepower while maintaining bombing accuracy. He insisted on flying straight into the target despite flak and fighters, because evasive action ruined bombing accuracy. He led from the front, flying the most dangerous missions himself, earning a reputation for personal bravery that would shield him from later criticism. But more importantly, he began to understand something that would define the rest of his career. Precision was a myth. In the chaos of war, with smoke and clouds obscuring targets, with aircraft shaking from explosions and crews terrified for their lives, the careful calculations of the bombing theorists meant nothing. Bombs fell where they fell. The neat distinction between military and civilian targets existed only on planning maps. Most commanders would have reported this failure to their superiors. LeMay instead began to develop a different philosophy. If precision was impossible, the answer wasn't less bombing, it was more. Overwhelming force, total destruction. Not targeting a factory within a city, but targeting the entire city itself. This was the logic that would lead to Tokyo. By 1943, Curtis LeMay was a brigadier general commanding the 3rd Bombardment Division, responsible for some of the most devastating raids of the European War. The famous raids on Regensburg and Schweinfurt showed both his tactical brilliance and his willingness to accept horrific casualties in pursuit of his objectives. The Schweinfurt-Regensburg mission on August 17, 1943 was typical LeMay, audacious, carefully planned, and brutally executed. The target was Germany's ball-bearing production, concentrated in a few factories. LeMay's bombers would strike deep into German territory without fighter escort, a suicide mission by conventional wisdom. Of the 230 aircraft that flew, 60 were shot down. 600 men died or were captured in a single day. But here's what made LeMay different from other commanders. He viewed those casualties not as a tragedy, but as data. The mission had achieved partial success, therefore the casualties were acceptable. When asked about the losses, he responded with characteristic bluntness. War is killing people. When you kill enough of them, they stop fighting. This philosophy reached its full expression in the campaign against German cities in 1944 and early 1945. While the British Royal Air Force conducted nighttime area bombing, essentially targeting entire cities to break civilian morale, American forces officially maintained their commitment to precision daylight bombing of military targets. But the lines were blurring. LeMay's bombers participated in raids on Berlin, Dresden, Hamburg, cities where the distinction between industrial zone and residential neighborhood became meaningless. In the firestorm at Hamburg in July 1943, which LeMay's forces contributed to, temperatures reached 1,500 degrees Fahrenheit. People in bomb shelters suffocated as the fires consumed all oxygen. Those who ran into the streets stuck to the melting asphalt and burned alive. 40,000 civilians died. The strategic bombing campaign over Europe remains controversial among historians. Some argue it was essential to victory, destroying German industrial capacity and forcing Germany to divert resources to air defense. Others contend it was largely ineffective. German war production actually increased until very late in the war, and that the campaign amounted to the systematic terrorizing of civilian populations. What's undeniable is that Curtis LeMay was learning lessons that he would apply with devastating effect in the Pacific. He learned that incendiary bombs were more destructive than high explosives. He learned that coordinated mass attacks overwhelmed defenses. He learned that weather, wind, and the construction materials of cities could be weaponized. Most importantly, he learned that the moral qualms that troubled other commanders, the squeamishness about civilian casualties, the reluctance to embrace total war, were luxuries that winners could not afford. In August 1944, Curtis LeMay received new orders. Report to the China-Burma-India Theater to take command of the 20th Bomber Command. It was both a promotion and a problem. The B-29 Superfortress, the most advanced bomber in the world, was underperforming dramatically. Missions against Japanese targets from bases in China were achieving minimal results while suffering significant losses. LeMay's approach was characteristically brutal. More training, more discipline, absolute standardization of procedures. Crews that couldn't meet his standards were grounded. Maintenance protocols were rewritten. He flew combat missions himself to identify problems firsthand. Within months, accuracy and effectiveness improved dramatically. But China was never going to work as a base for the strategic air campaign against Japan. The logistics were impossible. Fuel and bombs had to be flown over the Himalayas, the most dangerous air route in the world. In January 1945, LeMay received the assignment that would define his legacy: command of the 21st Bomber Command in the Mariana Islands, with responsibility for the strategic air war against the Japanese home islands. Here, finally, was the opportunity to implement his vision of total war completely. The situation he inherited was frustrating. Since November 1944, B-29s had been conducting high-altitude precision bombing raids against Japanese aircraft factories from bases in the Marianas. The results were dismal. At altitudes of 25 to 30,000 feet, the newly discovered jet stream, winds of up to 200 miles per hour, made accurate bombing impossible. Clouds obscured targets, mechanical failures plagued the complex B-29s in the cold, thin air. Mission after mission returned having accomplished nothing. Curtis LeMay looked at the problem with his characteristic coldness. Japan was not Germany. German cities were stone and concrete. Japanese cities were wood and paper. German industry was concentrated in specific factories. Japanese production was dispersed across thousands of small workshops in residential areas. German air defenses were sophisticated. Japanese defenses, by early 1945, were degraded and disorganized. The solution became obvious to him. Stop trying to bomb precisely. Instead, burn the cities to the ground. In early March 1945, Curtis LeMay made a series of decisions that would result in the single deadliest air raid in human history, more destructive than the atomic bombs that would fall on Hiroshima and Nagasaki 5 months later. The raid on Tokyo, codenamed Operation Meeting House, represented a radical departure from established strategic bombing doctrine. LeMay ordered his B-29s to fly at 5,000 to 7,000 feet instead of the usual 25,000 to 30,000 feet, strip out all defensive guns except the tail turret to carry more bombs, attack at night instead of day, use incendiary bombs exclusively with no high explosives, and concentrate on the most densely populated residential areas of Tokyo. Every one of these decisions violated Air Force doctrine and common sense. Flying low meant vulnerability to anti-aircraft fire and fighters. Removing defensive weapons left the bombers helpless if attacked. Night attacks made navigation and target identification nearly impossible. And deliberately targeting residential areas crossed the line that American forces had theoretically maintained between military and civilian targets. LeMay's staff opposed the plan. His bomber crews were terrified. But LeMay had done the calculations. Japanese air defenses were weak and poorly coordinated. Night fighters were few. The risk was acceptable given the potential destruction. He didn't seek approval from his superiors for the tactical changes. He simply issued the orders. If the mission failed, his career was over. If it succeeded, he would prove that Japan could be destroyed from the air without invasion, potentially saving hundreds of thousands of American lives and ending the war faster. On the afternoon of March 9, 1945, crews were briefed. Many thought it was suicide. Some wrote what they assumed would be final letters home. At sunset, 334 B-29 superfortresses began taking off from bases across the Marianas, forming up over the Pacific for the flight to Tokyo. The lead Pathfinder aircraft arrived over Tokyo shortly after midnight on March 10, 1945. They carried M47 napalm bombs, designed to mark the target with crosses of fire that following bombers would aim for. The area they marked was the Shitamachi district, the working-class heart of Tokyo, home to over 1 million people living in wooden houses packed impossibly close together. The weather was perfect for what LeMay intended. Strong winds, low humidity, cold temperatures. The city would burn like kindling. The main force arrived in waves. Each B-29 carried 7 tons of M69 incendiary cluster bombs. These weapons were diabolical in their design. Each cluster bomb contained 48 bomblets that scattered over a wide area. When they struck a roof, a small explosive charge punched the bomblet through the wood and into the house before the main incendiary charge ignited. Within seconds, the interior of the house would be engulfed in flames from jellied gasoline that stuck to everything it touched and burned at over 2,000 degrees.
The first bombers created scattered fires, but as more aircraft arrived and more incendiaries fell, the fires began to merge. Within 30 minutes, the individual fires had combined into something unprecedented, a firestorm. A firestorm is a meteorological phenomenon where fires become so large and hot that they create their own weather system. The rising column of superheated air creates ground-level winds rushing inward to feed the fire. In Tokyo that night, those winds reached speeds of up to 70 miles per hour. The temperature in the fire zone exceeded 1,800 degrees Fahrenheit, hot enough to melt glass, to boil water in canals, to ignite human beings through radiant heat alone. People trapped in the fire zone had no escape. Those who stayed in their homes burned to death as the wooden structures ignited around them. Those who fled into the streets found themselves in a hurricane of fire where the winds literally sucked people into the flames. Thousands jumped into canals and rivers to escape the heat, only to drown in the crush of bodies or be boiled alive as the water heated. Mothers clutching children were found transformed into charcoal statues, frozen in their final moments. The bombing continued for nearly 3 hours. Wave after wave of B-29s dropped their payloads into the firestorm, adding fuel to the inferno. Pilots later reported they could smell burning flesh inside their pressurized aircraft 5,000 feet above the city. The smoke rose so high that bombers arriving hours after the first attack had to climb to avoid it. When dawn broke on March 10, 1945, 16 square miles of Tokyo had been completely destroyed. The exact death toll remains uncertain. Japanese records were destroyed in the chaos, but modern estimates place it between 100,000 and 200,000 people killed in a single night. Another 1 million were left homeless. The casualty rate exceeded that of Hiroshima or Nagasaki. Curtis LeMay's gamble had succeeded beyond even his expectations. He had proved that incendiary attacks on Japanese cities could achieve total destruction at acceptable cost. Only 14 B-29s were lost, less than 5% of the attacking force. From his headquarters in the Marianas, he immediately began planning the next raids. The success of the Tokyo raid established the template for what would become one of the most destructive campaigns in military history. Over the next 5 months, Curtis LeMay's bombers methodically burned Japan's cities to ash. The list of targets reads like a catalog of urban destruction. Nagoya on March 11th, 12th, Osaka on March 13th, 14th, Kobe on March 16th, 17th, Tokyo again on April 13th, 14th, Nagoya again on May 14th, Tokyo again on May 23rd, 26th for 5 consecutive nights. By the time the atomic bombs fell in August, LeMay's conventional bombing campaign had already destroyed 180 square miles of urban Japan. 67 cities were attacked, 40 of them burned by more than 50%. Conservative estimates place the death toll from the incendiary campaign at 300,000 civilians, with another 400,000 injured and millions made homeless. What made this campaign particularly chilling was its systematic nature. LeMay approached the destruction of Japanese cities like an industrial process. His staff compiled detailed intelligence on every urban area, population density, construction materials, fire department capabilities, wind patterns. Cities were prioritized based on their vulnerability to fire and their importance to war production. The bombing patterns were refined with each raid. LeMay's planners discovered that creating fire breaks by bombing the perimeter of a target area first, then filling in the center, maximized destruction by trapping people and preventing firefighting efforts. They learned which incendiary mixtures burned hottest and spread fastest. They calculated the optimal altitude and spacing for aircraft to achieve maximum coverage. It was strategic bombing as science, conducted with engineering precision toward the goal of maximum human destruction. LeMay was not blind to what he was doing. In later interviews, he was characteristically blunt about the moral dimensions of the campaign. "I suppose if I had lost the war, I would have been tried as a war criminal. Fortunately, we were on the winning side." This statement reveals something crucial about LeMay's mindset. He understood that his actions existed in a moral gray area, or beyond it entirely. But he justified them through a brutal utilitarian logic. The bombing campaign would shorten the war, and a shorter war would ultimately save lives, including Japanese lives that would be lost in an invasion. The numbers supported his position, at least in a coldly calculating way. Military planners estimated that an invasion of the Japanese home islands would result in hundreds of thousands of American casualties and millions of Japanese casualties, military and civilian. If the bombing campaign could force surrender without invasion, wasn't the destruction of cities and the deaths of hundreds of thousands justified against the deaths of millions? This is the argument that LeMay made then and defenders of his actions make now. It's also the argument that his critics find morally bankrupt. The counter-argument goes like this: deliberately targeting civilians for mass death is a war crime under any ethical framework. The fact that it might lead to a faster victory doesn't justify it any more than any other atrocity is justified by military necessity. The Allies prosecuted German and Japanese leaders for precisely these kinds of attacks on civilian populations. The only difference was that LeMay won and they lost. Moreover, the historical record suggests that the bombing campaign's effectiveness in forcing Japanese surrender is overstated. Japan's leadership was already contemplating surrender by summer 1945, not primarily because of the bombing campaign, but because of the Soviet declaration of war and entry into the Pacific conflict. The atomic bombs and the conventional bombing campaign certainly contributed to the decision, but treating them as the sole or even primary cause oversimplifies a complex political and military calculation. What's undeniable is that Curtis LeMay made a deliberate decision to wage total war against civilian populations. He did so knowing it violated the theoretical boundaries of strategic bombing. He did so calculating that the destruction of cities would break Japanese morale and force surrender, and he did so without apparent moral qualms or hesitation. The end of World War II did not end Curtis LeMay's career in mass destruction, it merely changed the weapons. In 1948, he was appointed Commander of Strategic Air Command, the organization responsible for America's strategic bomber force and increasingly its nuclear deterrent. LeMay found SAC in disarray. In the chaos of post-war demobilization, training had declined, maintenance was poor, morale was low. In typical fashion, LeMay transformed the organization through sheer force of will and uncompromising standards. He instituted rigorous training programs, realistic combat exercises, and standardized procedures. Bomber crews that couldn't meet his demanding standards were grounded. Officers who couldn't maintain their aircraft to his specifications were relieved. Within 2 years, SAC was the most powerful military force in human history, but it was also the most terrifying. Because Curtis LeMay, the man who had burned Japanese cities to ash with conventional weapons, now controlled the nuclear arsenal of the United States. Under LeMay's command, SAC developed war plans of staggering destructiveness. The single integrated operational plan called for the simultaneous nuclear attack on thousands of targets across the Soviet Union and China in the event of war. Casualty estimates for these plans ran into the hundreds of millions. LeMay's planners calculated that the initial strikes would kill approximately 275 million people in the Soviet Union and China, with millions more dying from radiation and the collapse of civilization. And LeMay was prepared to execute these plans, more prepared, eager. He believed that a preemptive nuclear strike against the Soviet Union would save American lives in the long run by eliminating the communist threat before it could strike first. He argued repeatedly for first strike policies, shocking even hardline Cold Warriors with his willingness to start a nuclear war. In 1957, LeMay told a group of politicians that if he saw the Russians amassing their planes for an attack, he would strike them before they took off the ground. When asked if he had authority for such an attack, he responded that he didn't care, it was his policy, and that's what he was going to do. This was not idle talk. During the Cuban Missile Crisis in October 1962, LeMay was among the most aggressive voices pushing President Kennedy to launch airstrikes against Soviet missile sites in Cuba, fully aware that this would likely trigger World War III. Kennedy rejected his advice, negotiating a settlement instead. LeMay reportedly called this the greatest defeat in American history and believed Kennedy had shown weakness that would encourage Soviet aggression. What drove Curtis LeMay's apocalyptic worldview? Part of it was generational. He belonged to the World War II generation that had witnessed the consequences of allowing aggression to go unchecked. The lesson of Munich and appeasement was burned into his consciousness. Better to fight early, on your terms, than to wait until your enemy is stronger. But there was something deeper, too. LeMay genuinely believed that nuclear weapons had changed the fundamental calculus of war. In his view, the only way to prevent nuclear war was to maintain such overwhelming superiority that no adversary would dare attack. And if deterrence failed, the only rational response was massive, overwhelming retaliation that would destroy the enemy's capacity to fight back.
This philosophy, essentially peace through the threat of absolute annihilation, terrified America's allies and enemies alike. European leaders worried that LeMay would trigger a nuclear war that would obliterate their continent. Soviet leaders built their own nuclear arsenal partly out of genuine fear that LeMay would launch a first strike. And perhaps most disturbing, some of LeMay's colleagues in the military worried that he might actually do it. There were serious discussions in the Pentagon about whether safeguards needed to be implemented to prevent a SAC commander from launching nuclear weapons on his own authority. The fact that such conversations were necessary tells you everything about how LeMay was perceived even by those who worked with him. He served as Vice Chief of Staff of the Air Force from 1957 to 1961 and Chief of Staff from 1961 to 1965. Throughout this period, he remained a hawk's hawk, opposing arms control negotiations, advocating for expanded nuclear arsenals, and arguing for aggressive military action in every Cold War crisis. When he finally retired from the military in 1965, many in Washington breathed a sigh of relief. The man who controlled America's nuclear arsenal could no longer start World War III on his own initiative. Curtis LeMay's entry into politics was as controversial as his military career. In 1968, he became the running mate of George Wallace, the segregationist governor of Alabama, in Wallace's third-party presidential campaign. The campaign was a disaster for LeMay's reputation. At his first press conference as a candidate, he defended the potential use of nuclear weapons in Vietnam, suggesting that America's reluctance to use nukes showed weakness. He told reporters that we seemed to have a phobia about nuclear weapons, seemingly unable to understand why the American public might be hesitant about nuclear war. The press conference became infamous. Reporters, stunned by his casual discussion of nuclear weapons, pressed him on the issue. LeMay, growing frustrated, made his position even clearer. He didn't believe the world would end if we exploded a nuclear weapon, and that nuclear weapons were just another weapon in the arsenal. Wallace, standing beside him, reportedly turned pale. The campaign spent the next weeks trying to walk back LeMay's statements, but the damage was done. The ticket won 13.5% of the popular vote in 5 states, a respectable showing for a third-party campaign, but nowhere near the disruption Wallace had hoped for. LeMay's nuclear enthusiasm had turned him into a liability and a punchline. The failed campaign marked the end of LeMay's time in the public eye. He retired to California, largely withdrawing from public life, though he occasionally gave interviews or spoke at military functions. He published his memoirs and collaborated on several books about strategic air power. In these later years, he never wavered in his belief that he had done the right thing in World War II and during the Cold War. He remained convinced that his willingness to embrace total war had saved American lives and that his nuclear brinkmanship had prevented World War III. Curtis LeMay's death on October 1, 1990 at the age of 83 received significant media attention, with obituaries split between praising his effectiveness as a commander and questioning his moral legacy. Military historians lauded his tactical innovations and organizational genius. Ethicists and peace advocates cited him as an example of how military necessity can be used to justify atrocities. The debate over his legacy continues to this day. The historical assessment of Curtis LeMay remains deeply divided. His defenders point to his undeniable effectiveness as a military commander. He transformed strategic bombing from a theoretical concept into a decisive weapon. His organizational reforms at Strategic Air Command created the modern nuclear deterrent. His personal bravery and leadership from the front inspired his crews and validated his authority. Most importantly, they argue, his bombing campaign helped end World War II without the need for a catastrophic invasion of Japan, ultimately saving millions of lives on both sides. His critics see something darker. They argue that LeMay represents the moral corruption that total war inflicts on even democratic societies. His willingness to deliberately target civilians from mass death violated international law and basic ethical principles. The fact that he won the war doesn't change the fact that what he did, burning hundreds of thousands of civilians alive, would be considered a war crime if committed by the losing side. They point to his later advocacy for nuclear first strikes as evidence that his willingness to embrace mass destruction went beyond military necessity into something more troubling, a genuine belief that overwhelming violence was the solution to complex political problems. The truth, as always, is more complicated than either simple narrative allows. Curtis LeMay was a product of his time and circumstances, shaped by the total war ideology of World War II and the existential stakes of the Cold War. He was also a man of genuine conviction who believed that his actions, however horrific, were necessary to protect American lives and preserve freedom. Whether those beliefs justify what he did is a question that each generation must answer for itself. What's beyond dispute is the scale of destruction that Curtis LeMay was responsible for. Conservative estimates place the civilian death toll from his bombing campaigns at over 300,000, with hundreds of thousands more injured and millions made homeless. The Tokyo firestorm alone killed more people in a single night than any military action in history except for the atomic bombings. Had LeMay gotten his way during the Cold War, the death toll from nuclear strikes on the Soviet Union and China would have reached into the hundreds of millions. The question that haunts LeMay's legacy is this: at what point does military effectiveness become war crime? When does the willingness to do whatever it takes to win cross the line into something morally unacceptable? LeMay himself recognized this tension in his famous statement about being tried as a war criminal if he had lost. But recognizing the problem is not the same as solving it. In the decades since LeMay's death, historians have gained access to more complete records of the bombing campaigns and their effects. What emerges from this research is a picture of systematic destruction that went far beyond military necessity. Japanese cities were targeted not primarily for their industrial capacity, but for their vulnerability to fire and the psychological impact their destruction would have. Intelligence reports from the time make clear that planners knew they were targeting civilian populations and that the casualty rates would be catastrophic. The comparison to war crimes committed by Axis powers is unavoidable. At the Nuremberg trials and Tokyo War Crime Tribunal, German and Japanese leaders were prosecuted for, among other crimes, the systematic destruction of civilian areas and the mass murder of non-combatants. The legal principle established at those trials was that following orders or military necessity does not excuse such actions. The prosecutors argued, and the tribunals agreed, that certain acts are so fundamentally wrong that no military justification can excuse them. Curtis LeMay's bombing campaigns meet the definition of the crimes for which enemy commanders were executed. The only legally and morally relevant difference is that LeMay was on the winning side. This doesn't necessarily mean that LeMay should have been prosecuted. The complexities of total war, the genuine threat posed by the Axis powers, and the difficult choices faced by Allied commanders all complicate any simple moral judgment. But it does mean that we cannot avoid the uncomfortable truth that victory, not morality, determined who was held accountable for the mass killing of civilians in World War II. The nuclear age added new dimensions to this moral calculus. LeMay's advocacy for first strike policies and his casual attitude toward nuclear war reflected a worldview in which the survival of the United States justified any action, no matter how destructive. This was Cold War logic taken to its extreme conclusion. Better to kill hundreds of millions in a first strike than risk allowing the Soviet Union to strike first. The fact that this position was seriously advocated by a senior military commander with actual control over nuclear weapons should be deeply disturbing to anyone who values human life and international law. Yet there is another side to this story. Curtis LeMay lived in a world where the stakes were genuinely existential. World War II was a war of survival against genuinely evil regimes that had already demonstrated their willingness to commit genocide and conquer entire continents. The Cold War involved nuclear-armed superpowers engaged in an ideological struggle where miscalculation could mean the end of civilization. In such a context, the luxury of moral purity may have been just that, a luxury that commanders responsible for national survival could not afford. This is not to justify everything LeMay did. It is to acknowledge that he operated in a context where terrible choices were unavoidable and where the consequences of failure were unthinkable. The bombing of Japanese cities was horrific, but so would have been an invasion that killed millions. Nuclear brinkmanship was terrifying, but so was the prospect of Soviet domination of Europe and Asia. LeMay made his choices, and we live with the consequences, both the millions of lives saved by ending the war quickly and the hundreds of thousands of civilians burned to death in the process. The most troubling aspect of Curtis LeMay's legacy may be his apparent lack of moral struggle with these decisions. Other commanders agonized over the moral implications of strategic bombing. Dwight Eisenhower expressed deep reservations about the atomic bombs. Robert McNamara, who worked with LeMay during World War II, later came to believe that the firebombing campaign was immoral. But LeMay never wavered. He remained convinced until his death that he had done the right thing, that the moral qualms of others were luxuries that winners could not afford. This absolutism, this certainty in the righteousness of overwhelming force, is perhaps what makes LeMay such a controversial figure. He represents a worldview in which military effectiveness trumps moral considerations, in which winning justifies nearly any method, in which the deaths of hundreds of thousands of civilians can be reduced to an acceptable cost in pursuit of victory. This worldview won World War II and arguably prevented World War III, but it also created a precedent for total war that has haunted international relations ever since. The question of Curtis LeMay's place in history ultimately depends on how we balance effectiveness against morality. Was he a brilliant commander who made hard choices that saved countless lives? Or was he a war criminal who happened to win? The answer may be both. History is full of figures who were simultaneously great and terrible, who achieved important goals through morally questionable means. Curtis LeMay belongs to this uncomfortable category of historical figures who force us to confront the gap between what works and what's right. In the final analysis, Curtis LeMay was the architect of modern total war, the man who proved that civilian populations could be systematically destroyed from the air and that such destruction could achieve strategic goals. He did this with cold efficiency, without apparent moral qualms, and without apology. Whether history judges him as a hero or a villain depends less on the facts of what he did, those are clear enough, and more on how we choose to weigh military necessity against human life, victory against morality, ends against means. What cannot be disputed is the scale of destruction he caused and the precedent he set. Curtis LeMay demonstrated that democracies, when faced with existential threats, are capable of committing acts of mass destruction that rival or exceed those of the most brutal dictatorships. He showed that nice people,
operating within legal frameworks and chains of command, can systematically kill hundreds of thousands of civilians if they believe it serves a greater good. And he proved that such actions, if undertaken by the winning side, will be justified rather than punished. This is Curtis LeMay's true legacy. Not just the cities he burned or the people he killed, but the precedent he established and the uncomfortable truths he revealed about what democracies are willing to do to win wars. We live in a world shaped by his actions, where strategic bombing of civilian areas is an accepted tool of warfare, where nuclear weapons remain on constant alert, where military necessity regularly trumps humanitarian concerns. Whether this world is safer or more dangerous because of Curtis LeMay remains an open question. The general died believing he had saved his country and prevented the apocalypse. His critics believe he brought us closer to it. History will continue to debate which view is correct, but what's certain is that Curtis LeMay, the Ohio boy who learned to calculate trajectories and discount human costs, who burned cities and planned to burn nations, who never doubted and never apologized, remains one of the most significant and controversial military figures of the 20th century. His story is a dark mirror held up to the face of total war, showing us what we are capable of when we decide that winning is all that matters.